Sorry. Fix that. All right. So back in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 16, let me just read it for you. It says, to deliver you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God, for her house leads down to death and her paths to the dead. None who go to her to return, nor do they regain the paths of life. So that really is a summary of what we're going to be talking about today in chapter 5. As I mentioned, chapters 5, 6, and 7 all have large elements that deal with the immoral woman and adultery. So we'll be talking about this for a little while here. Hopefully we can get through chapter 5 today. We'll see. So chapter 5, verse 1, again, my son, pay attention to wisdom, as I mentioned last time. Obviously, the son here is older because he's talking to him about adultery and about, sexual temptation, essentially. Verse 2, that you may preserve discretion and your lips may keep knowledge. I just wanted to remind you again to connect chapter 5 with chapter 4. Right, to preserve discretion. So discretion, again, was practical wisdom, the application of wisdom. And really that, to preserve it in your heart is what he's really focusing on here. Preserve that practical wisdom in your heart. Don't allow it to get taken over by something else. Make sure that you've got a hold, a firm grasp on it. And then in verse 3, for the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil, right? So at the end of verse 2, your lips may keep knowledge. And we mentioned, again, that we ought to be speaking about knowledge, speaking about truth, speaking about what is important, such that when the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, we already have locked in our heart what is the truth and what is real. I also wanted to remind you of the word intercourse. That's a word that we normally associate with sexual intercourse, but actually the word intercourse simply means an exchange of ideas, thoughts, emotions. And the point I think here is, the lips of an immoral woman drip honey. The beginning of getting in trouble with sexual intercourse is regular intercourse. Is these discussions, these conversations. And we talked about this a little bit last time. We talked about what are those honey words? What are the ways that the evil woman tried to entrap you? It's about sharing emotions and sharing feelings, right? And telling you how wonderful you are. It's just the point that, you get into trouble with words. That's where it starts. Verse 4, but in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. I do want to just flip for a minute. Go to Ecclesiastes. So the next book after Proverbs is Ecclesiastes. Most folks agree it was also written by Solomon a little bit later in life when he was not so upbeat. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. This has a word for us, though. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 26. It says, I find more bitter than death that the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. So, right. So this woman who is a snare and snares, and I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. It comes across as dripping honey and smoother than oil, but in the end, it's a snare. It's a trap. The end is bitter and like a two-edged sword. Because verse 5, I'm back in Proverbs 5. Verse 5, her feet go down to death. Her steps lay hold of hell, right? And if we don't have to turn there, but if we go to Revelations, there are many places where it talks about the wrath of her fornication, the finality of adultery, right? Her immorality, they all lead to death. And what's interesting is the connection between the immorality of Israel, right? The immorality of us turning away from God and leading to death. And there's definitely a connection in these verses, and you need to make it in your head, between the immoral woman as he attacks us as humans, and also the immorality of going to another god, right? The immorality of not staying pure with God, but going to other gods, other things that attract us and pull us away from God. So you need to run that track in your mind as we're going through this about adultery. It's not only physical adultery, but it's also spiritual adultery as we look on something else as attractive apart from God. Verse 6, lest you ponder her path of life, her ways are unstable, you do not know them. We talked last time. This one's a little bit confusing to understand. The commentaries have several different interpretations of this one. The one that I kind of ended up liking is that saying that her ways are unstable. Her path is unstable. Her path is hidden, if you will. She hides her path through deception. And so the real instruction here is don't follow after her path, because it's a deceived, unstable one. You can't see it. And you think you're going down a good path. It's, all honey and smoothness. But the reality is it's an unstable, hidden path that's going to take you to death, as we've already talked about. All right, verse 7 then. Therefore, hear now, my children, do not depart from the words of my mouth. As I mentioned, now from here until verse 14, we get into the details about this problem with adultery. And so let's go to verse 8. This is where we stopped last time. And I read it and said, remove your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, right? The instruction here is stay as far away as possible from adultery, from this immoral woman, from this one with enticing words. And I asked you as kind of a homework assignment, what are the ways that you have put things in your life to keep you from getting in trouble in this arena? What have you done to make sure you have not fallen into adultery? What practical lessons could you share with others that you think have worked for you to keep you from getting in trouble here? Go.
One thing that I did when I in my office, and I got this advice from an agent right when I started, try to prevent or limit the number of times you have appointments after hours with a single female, and always try to keep to that either be with a husband or wife during business hours, no problem, but very seldom would I ever have anything after hours. It always worked well.
Good. What else?
That's probably one of the biggest ones, to limit personal time paired up. Just a pair with somebody. I mean.
No, that's good. That's an important one. Anything else?
Stephanie would like to share one.
As we mentioned last time, adultery used to be a man problem, but adultery now is a 60-40 man to woman problem. So we've given females a lot of sexual freedom, and as a result, they're getting to the same kind of problems now that men are getting into. So this is not just when we talk about. I know that the scripture is very much leans towards this is a man problem, but this is much more shared now, unfortunately. So
when we're texting someone, we just include both of us if we're texting an individual for whatever reason. We just like
of the opposite sex.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
it's good.
So with technology, I mean, share your locations, share your passwords.
Yep, good.
phone is wide open.
With your
Mine
spouse.
too.
When I hear couples talk about stuff like that, where they're, I can't believe she was trying to get into my phone. Yeah, I shake my head.
Yeah.
What's the point? I mean, I'm wide, you try to be wide open.
Good. The only other one I would add, the meeting one is an important one, and you know, I did the same thing when I was working. That the other one, I think that there were some people at work that I had to have very close relationships with in order to do my job, and one of them I had a personal assistant for a while. That was a female, that was a young female that I was very close to. What I made sure was that she had a relationship with Joe. Right, that they got to know each other, that they knew each other well. And in fact, what's funny is now they text each other and wish each other happy birthday years after I no longer work with that individual. But it was important to me to make sure that Joe knew her and knew who she was, and that they had a relationship. And you know, that was critically important, so that I didn't get into any trouble there. So that was one that worked well for us. The other thing I would say, go ahead.
Bottom line is just, you don't put yourself in a situation where there was even chance of temptation. You just don't do it.
Yeah.
It's just, you just make the conscious choice that you're not gonna do it.
The other one I'll share was a mistake that I made. Early in our marriage, I was involved in community theater. And there was an event, I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was some kind of party after the show or something, and I was playing around with some of the female cast members, you know, and I don't even remember what we were doing, but I remember Joe come up to me and saying, you know, you got to stop that. You can't do that. And I was, you know, I'm completely a dumb, stupid guy, right? I'm like, I don't see the problem here. I don't understand what the issue is, right? But I did listen to my wife, and you know, of course, realized later that was really stupid, right? The kind of playing around that I was doing with these females was not smart, was not wise. And I think you know, it's important that she has a better sensor than I do with regard to things like this. She sees things that I don't see in the way other females are acting, and so it was really important to me to learn to listen to her about those kinds of relationships, and that was a key element.
So
Anything else? Good.
That cuts my hair. She used to be in a shop. She's become disabled and now she lives in a mobile home. So I get Susie to go with me to get my hair cut. She sits in the truck. It's nothing, but it's not just that confrontation, but I'm in a mobile home park. I'm going in this lady's house for 15 minutes, coming out the door. It's the appearance. It's the appearance. Somebody else, oh, I saw you so-and-so. It's not that you're guilty. It's not that you meant anything, but it's also the appearance of it.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, good. So I just wanted to pause there because it's you know, this is a very practical and important subject for us, and the scripture clearly says, you know, remove your way far from her, right? Keep away, do not go near the door of her house. And so I think what you guys have shared is good.
Hey, Rich,
Yeah.
something else that crosses my mind is, so you'll hear it today. There were a lot of, I'm trying to figure out the way to describe women who complained all get out when they heard that Vice President Pence would not meet with a woman one-on-one. You know, he always had to have somebody in the room, and you know, and they tore him up, you know, one side down the other for somehow they thought it was such a bad thing. So the world points us to these things and says it's okay, and you know, they don't recognize we're trying to guard our hearts. Yeah. They make it sound like we're insulting them, you know, the women that he won't meet with individually, because they tried to make it sound like he didn't trust them. And really, he probably was trying to make sure he doesn't trust himself.
Yeah.
To some extent. It's just trying to, again, it's an appearance thing, but the world points us into these things and says it's okay, and they don't even recognize
And again, this is the lesson of Proverbs over and over and over again, right? That these patterns, these principles that God lays out for us are for our protection. They're for our good. And the world has no concept of these principles, right? And no concept of these patterns. And that's why they end up in the trouble that they end up in. So absolutely true, CT. All right, let's go on then to verse 9 and 10. Verse 9 says, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one, lest aliens be filled with your wealth and your labors go to the house of the foreigner. So this is why you don't do adultery. One of the, one set of reasons, right? Lest you give your honor to others. So notice that it has 4 different groups there. It has others, the cruel one, aliens, and the foreigner. So all of these are essentially relationships outside of your marriage. Others, this cruel one, the aliens, foreigner. You're gonna give your honor. You're gonna give your years. You're gonna give your wealth. You're gonna give your labors or the fruits of your labors, right? I mean, essentially saying if you do these things, your reputation, your honor, your splendor, your youth is being given away, your dignity. All that you have accomplished and your reputation, your wealth, all of that gets given away. This cruel one, right? The cruel one is one who promises everything and delivers nothing but destruction, right? Promises wonderful things and actually gives destruction. So your wealth is taken care of, is gone away. Your labors or the fruits of your labors have gone away. One thing to just pause here and recognize is that in Deuteronomy, what was the punishment for adultery?
Stoning.
It was stoning. It was death, right? And so what's interesting is what actually happened over time was when there was adultery, that the person who committed adultery was actually handed over to the family to whom this was done against. And they had the option of bringing stoning upon him, bringing him to the assembly and getting him stoned, or of that person becoming a slave to that family. So when it talks here about, your wealth will be taken away, your labors will be taken away by a foreigner, essentially that's what happens, is the person actually becomes a slave to that other family, and all their wealth and reputation and stuff gets taken away. Now, we don't do either of those things today. Of course, we have things like alimony and child support, and frankly, the biggest thing is just the brokenness of families that takes place when this happens. But the message here is your wealth, your honor, your reputation, your peace, your friends, your youth, your vitality, your health, your life will be taken away. And that's what the real message is here in verses 9 to 10. And then finally, we get to 11, it says, and you mourn at last when your flesh and your body are consumed, right? You mourn, you cry. The commentaries here says that this mourning is like a growl, like an injured lion, right? You're just in pain, this mourning that happens. It happens at last, or some of your translation may say at the end, right? At the end of your life, when you have completed this wasting of your life, this comes. I do want you to look at an interesting verse back in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12. Now, what's funny about this verse is that either last week or the week before, I read this verse to you, and I read it because I was thinking about this application, and I read it, and you all just had a blank stare because it actually didn't make any sense in the context that I was reading it last time. So now I have it in the right context. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. We can start at 14. 14, Hebrews 12:14 is pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Looking carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up to cause you trouble, and by this many become defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit a blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. Let's look at verse 16, right? You're talking here about Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthrights. And you know, he's a fornicator in the sense that he is going after other gods. He is not following after God. And in fact, he sells his relationship with God for a morsel of food. But then also verse 17, right? Afterwards, he wanted to inherit the blessing and there was no opportunity for him. I think what we see now back in Proverbs, what we see here is this man, right? He's recognizing that he has messed up, right? At the end, he is mourning when his flesh and his body, his reputation and his life has been consumed. Now he's mourning. And look at verses 12 and 13. And say, how have I hated instruction, and my heart despised correction? I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. So he's recognizing that he has been given instruction. He has been given the patterns. He has been told what the right things are by his teachers, by those mentors that he has had, and he's not listened to them. And in fact, he's despised that correction. He's hated that instruction. I really think what you have here is someone who is lamenting his position, who is going to hell, who recognize and he's lost the opportunity to actually turn and go on to Christ and do the right thing, because he has continued to do this this evil thing. So the point that's being tried to make is you will mourn at the last. You will mourn at the end if you take this path. All right, at verse 15 now we have a little shift. We've been talking about adultery and the dangers of adultery and the results of adultery. Now when we get to 15 through almost the end of the chapter, we actually start talking about marriage, and we start talking about sex within marriage. And he's trying to show you that, I'll just give you the summary of it, that that sex within marriage is a prophylactic against adultery, right? It is something that keeps you from falling into the trap of adultery. So let's read through it. Drink from your own cistern and running water from your own well, right? So again, he's trying to say here, and not just in this verse, but the rest of it, that lovemaking within marriage is protection from temptation of sex outside of marriage. I do want you to turn, before we even get further into this, to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which has a great lesson on this also. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Turn there, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we'll begin at verse 2. I'll make sure you're there. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2, it says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to the wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. Don't miss that part. Let the husband render to the wife the affection due her, and likewise to the wife to her husband. Verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Boy, this will really go well with the liberals today, won't it? Let's keep going. Verse 5, do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Right? So he's saying there, do not deprive one another of sex, of sexual lovemaking, except by consent, and consent for a reason that he gives here, right? Such that you don't fall into immorality, because Because you, dag nabbit, you humans lack self-control, right? All right, now let's go back to Proverbs. So that's exactly what he's saying here. When he says drink water from your own cistern, he's really talking about your own husband, your own wife. That's where your lovemaking ought to come from. Drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. If you go down to 18b, right? 18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. So again, that's what he's talking about. Your wife, your husband, get sexually refreshed from your spouse, right? And this is when the term here, running water, means it's good water. It's refreshing water. It's better quality water than you're going to get outside and you're going to get from some other cistern that is not yours. And by the way, there's plenty of water in that stream. All right, verse 16. Now, verse 16 is another one of those verses that the commentaries are all over the place on. Let me read it to you. Mine says, should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets. Now, mine has a question mark at the end. Obviously, in the Greek, there's no question mark. And so in some of the translations says, you know, your fountains should be dispersed abroad and your streams of water should be dispersed into the streets. So there's two different ways of interpreting this. One is you should disperse your streams. In other words, when they talk about streams here, he's really talking about children. He's really talking about progeny. He's saying that you should disperse you should have a good relationship with your wife such that you have many children, and your many children then get dispersed and take over the earth, if you will. That's one interpretation of it. The other one is that you ought to confine your your children to just your wife and not to someone else. Do not disperse it. Do not disperse it into into others, which I really think is which is more accurate because of the connections with the rest of the verses. If you look to verse 17, then it says, "Let them be only your own and not for strangers with you." So I think he's there talking about these streams and these fountains, these children. Let them be with your own wife. Let them be your own children, right? Not children that will go to strangers. And I think that connects back up to verses 9 and 10, right, when it talks about your honor, your labors, your wealth, going into strangers. The connection here is your children. You all of a sudden, the fruit of your body, your children, are actually now going to strangers. So I think that is the connection. Let them only be your own cistern, your own fountain, not with strangers. Now, verse 18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. This is an interesting verse here because it's kind of a prayer. It's kind of a prayer that Solomon is praying over his son and saying, I pray that your fountain will be blessed, that your wife will be blessed, that you will rejoice over the wife of your youth, right? That's what he wants for his son, that your wife will be a blessing to you, and that you will, focus on that wife of your youth and not go to other places. So there's no question in all of these verses that God is laying out a pattern here, right? A pattern of a long marriage, a pattern of marriage with one wife, right? That's just because he's saying, don't have children by someone else. It's a monogamous long marriage. That is the pattern. That's the pattern that he's laying down here. Now, verse 19, mine reads, "As a loving deer and graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times, and always be enraptured with her love." So I think this is the continuation of the prayer that Solomon is having for his son. And this is when it says, let your fountain be blessed in verse 18, this is the blessing that he wants. This is the wife that he wants for his son, that she be as a loving deer and graceful doe. And by the way, those words are used to really talk about her beauty, her attitude, right, as a loving deer and a graceful doe. And really the word loving here is better translated a love-making deer, a deer that makes love, because the word there is very much a sensual, loving deer. And then the graceful doe is really about a beautiful, graceful fawn, right? So he's praying for his son to have a wife that is beautiful and that makes love in a way that is satisfying, because again, the next part says, let her breast satisfy you at all times. And by the way, the word breast there is really better translated nipples. It really is her, he's really saying, let her erogenous zones satisfy you, right? Let that be your satisfaction. Always be enraptured by her love. Always be satisfied. In fact, the word is so strong, it's you should be intoxicated with what you get from your wife. You should be completely full and overwhelmed by that sensual love. And notice it says always, right? It always ought to be something that captures you and enraptures you. So this is his prayer, that your fountain, your wife, will be blessed, and blessed in this way, that she be completely. And obviously, as we take this to both sexes, right, that your spouse will completely satisfy you. That is what God's desire is. And again, the reason is it becomes a prophylactic. I can't think of a better word, right, to keep you from adultery, because you are so enraptured and wrapped up in your wife. That is the pattern. That is the principle that God is laying down. All right, verse 20. For why should you, my son, be enraptured by an immoral woman and be embraced in the arms of his seductress? I mean, essentially he's saying, in light of verse 19, in light of the relationship that you have with your wife, it's just idiotic. I mean, it's just absurd to think that someone else, that you would go to someone else, because you are fully enraptured, fully satisfied with the wife that has been given to you. Again, that is the pattern. So he's saying here, why be enraptured by an immoral woman? There's no reason to do that, because you have a wife, the wife of your youth, that completely takes care of you. And by the way, when it says here, mine says, and be embraced in the arms of a seductress. A better translation is to be embraced in the bosom of a seductress. He's really talking about, again, sexual intercourse there. He's saying that, why would you have sexual intercourse with a seductress when you have what you have at home? All right, man, we're going through this pretty fast because y'all are not interrupting me when I'm making these interesting statements, are you? All right, verse 21. Verse 21. So now he steps back and he has more of a summarizing statements in verses 21 and 22. For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. The ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. If you can find it, turn to 2 Chronicles. Go to the left. 2 Chronicles. It's right after 1 Chronicles. Chapter 16. It's a verse that you have heard before, but again, I want to keep it here in context. 2 Chronicles, verse 16.
What chapter?
16. 2 Chronicles 16, verse 9. right? First Chronicles 16:9. Mine says, "For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. In this you have done foolishly, and therefore now, from now on, you shall have wars." He's speaking to a particular king here. But the point is, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth. His point is to see you doing well, right? To see those whose heart is loyal to him. But for those who have done foolishly, there's going to be a response. And that's what he's saying again now back in Proverbs. The ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all his paths. He ponders. God ponders our path. You remember right back in chapter 4, where was it, verse 26, right? Where Solomon was instructing his son, ponder the path of your feet. Let all your ways, and all your ways will be established, right? He was telling them, watch where you're going, watch where you've been. And the point now is, because God is watching, God is paying attention to your past, to the steps that you're taking, to the actions that you're doing, right? Ponder your path because God is pondering it. He looks at the track that you've made, and then he also looks at where you're going and what the steps are. And he's going to be watching those steps. He's watching those tracks. Now, either that makes you feel really good or it terrifies you, right? So I don't know if I think I've told this story here before. When I was a youth, I had a reoccurring dream. The dream was that I was running and God was chasing me. And, he could see me and he was chasing me. And the only way I could hide from him was to get under newspaper. For some reason, if you get under newspaper, then God couldn't see you under newspaper. So, I don't think that has anything to do with scripture, but I think it does have to do with God, trying to get a hold of me and trying to actually capture me. This was before I was saved. So anyway, God is paying attention. He's paying attention to the steps that you're taking.
Hey,
All
Rich.
right. Yeah.
There's also a lot of analogies to our like hidden sin and things with light and darkness.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because darkness is you're hiding with our sin, and we're hiding behind things, and can't be seen, and all of a sudden you apply a great light, and everything's open. You can see everything, and so I can't remember all the exact verses, but there's a lot of.
Yeah, and we've covered them some already as we've gone through Proverbs, and it's going to come up again. He uses that analogy between light and dark several times here in Proverbs, so that's going to come back. Absolutely true. And it's all, the other thing is nothing good happens in the dark, right? Yeah, so same thing. All right, verse 22. His own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. So I read that verse to you earlier, right, about being entrapped by the adulteress, and I think we have the same kind of idea here, right? That he is entrapped by his own wickedness, and we've seen this before in Proverbs when we talked about the men who are digging a ditch and falling into their own ditch. You're going to get trapped by your own deeds. You're going to get caught. You're going to pay the price for your own sin. One of the commentaries also made the comments, evil deeds become evil habits, right? So this is why stay away. And this is why we talk about, if you're on the path, get off the path, right? Because evil deeds become evil habits. And once they become evil habits, they become very difficult to give up, very difficult to walk away from, whether that's the beginning of a relationship, the beginning of conversations that all of a sudden you got to say, no, I'm not going to have those conversations anymore. No, I'm not going to be as close to you as I have been. Once you develop those kinds of things, it's very hard to break them. So evil deeds become evil habits. And once they're evil habits, they're very difficult to break away from. The other thing is that evil thinking imprisons us from breaking free from that evil, right? So we start thinking that this is okay. We rationalize the conversations. We rationalize the relationship, the intercourse, right? The beginnings of this thing. We rationalize it, and then our thinking becomes it imprisons us. It locks us in, and we can't get out because we think, well, this is fine, this is good, this is healthy. It's good for me to have another outlet for my pain and suffering, blah, 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 right? And it imprisons us into actually escaping from the very thing that we should not be involved in. And then the other thing I would just add that, when it talks here about, that we're caught and entrapped in these things, the earthly consequences of adultery should be bad enough to keep us from adultery. Nevertheless, the eternal consequences, right? The eternal consequences are death and separation from God, but the earthly consequences are bad enough, right? As he talked about the loss of our youth, the loss of our wealth, the loss of our honor and reputation, et cetera, et cetera. Verse 23, he shall die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. He shall die for lack of instruction. I was listening to, some of you know who Mike Rowe is, the Dirty Jobs guy. He has a podcast that I listen to because he has some really interesting guests on there that just talk about stuff. He had a guy on there the other day I was listening to who was a mental health expert. And he was saying that there are more people now that are being treated for mental health issues than there have ever been in the history of the world by orders of magnitude. And he went on. The guy went on to say that one of the reasons is that they people just don't know how to raise their children anymore. They don't know how to have a healthy relationship. They don't know how to respond when things go bad. And all I'm thinking in my head was, yeah, they don't have the patterns. They don't have the principles, right? And without them, the world's in a mess, and they're having to go to mental health people to try to get straightened out because they don't understand the patterns. They don't, and they're, as it says here, they're trapped in their own folly because they lack instruction. They lack the details that for generations we were passing down to our children and our grandchildren. Now, as you guys have said, they're all looked upon as folly, right? They're all looked upon as silliness. Why would I not be in a room with a woman? That's just ridiculous. Blah blah blah, right? They're all looked upon as folly, and as a result, we've got a mental health crisis. We've got a relationship crisis in the world right now. So he shall die for lack of instruction. He certainly shall be entrapped in his own stuff because of his lack of the patterns. And again, this is to me why God has sent us into Proverbs, to understand these patterns and these principles such that we don't get entrapped by the world's beliefs and the world's understanding of what's true. So, all right. We finished a whole chapter and we did it early. How did that happen? That never happens. That never happens in here. So just as a reminder, right? So the first part of this, is all about adultery and why you shouldn't do it and what are the pains and sufferings of it. The second part is about really sex inside of marriage, love making inside of marriage, and why that ought to be satisfying. And then finally, just these general comments about the just entrapment of your sin as you ignore the patterns and if you don't pay attention to what God is trying to teach us. So That in a summary is what we have dealt with here in chapter 5. Comments, questions, additional thoughts?
I know that this is all talking about the adulterous, physical, in-person kind of thing, but in today's world, there's definitely needs to be a lot of guarding yourself before you even get to that point with, computers, movies, just everything that's out there. So there's got to be choices there to guard that, because I feel like that's where it's coming in first almost. It's getting in your head.
Yep. And that takes us right back to, chapter 4, right, where he says, do not let these things depart from your eyes, keep them in the midst of your heart, right? He's saying, guard your eyes, guard your heart, right? And that takes us right to verse 8. Remove them way far from her. Do not go near the door. The door to her house is on the internet. The door to her house is in movies that you shouldn't be watching. Absolutely true. Thanks, Debbie.
I just wanted to add too that, if someone has fallen into this, that there's healing, there's forgiveness in Christ. There's still consequences, but there's, we have to, recognize that part of it also along with the principles.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Again, when I teach what's in front of me and the strength of it, but you got to balance it with the rest of Scripture. Scripture does say there's forgiveness for sin, right? And sometimes we put some sins greater than other sins. God doesn't. They're all the same to him. Anything that separates you from God is a sin, and those sins can be forgiven through Christ, and you can reestablish a relationship. So good balance, Hugh. Anything else? All right. This will not be the last thing we have to say about adultery, as we have chapter 6 and 7 ahead of us. And fortunately, we're not going to do the Song of Solomon. Otherwise, I'm not sure how much of this I could take. But
These ratings.
yeah, we'd have to check your IDs on the way in or something. So. All right. Let's go ahead and begin with prayer requests then. Joe, let's start here.
Stop the recording.
See, you told me to stop the recording. Thank you.